Right, we'll get the afternoon show on the road. So it's a huge privilege to introduce Dominic Selwood. Dominic is another veteran. He was at the first West Cork History Festival when it was in a tent in our back garden. A number of people here were. He is one of those people who it ought to be impossible to like. He's a brilliant scholar. He wrote his DPhil on the Hospitallers in Occitania in 2 years flat. He then went off and trained for the bar, was called to the bar, did that with distinction for a few years, then got bored, decided that Islamic banking was where the future for the financial services sector lay. He was right, and did that for Deutsche Bank originally. And while doing all of this, which for any of the rest of us would have, kind of eaten into the day a bit, he has continued to produce novels, works of history, and then things that genuinely edify the, I got into trouble for saying this yesterday, this is not intended to be pejorative to professional academic historians, but for the non-scholarly, interested and intelligent and historically intrigued public. He produces books on history, and this book, The Anatomy of a Nation, is the latest exercise in that. He will tell you a little bit about it, but it is, as you might have gathered from the title, a way of looking at the history of the neighbouring island and its, at intervals, its relationship to this one as well as to the continent of Europe, through the lens of critical documents and the context in which they were written. So you're in safe and entertaining hands. And Dominic, thank you for coming. He's come from Kinsale this morning. It sounds as though it's been an interesting drive, but maybe that will feature in what you say. But Dominic, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you. And as you can hear from that introduction, my life has been a steady slide downhill. But hopefully this afternoon we can pick some of it up. Well, thank you very much for coming to this talk. When I was writing this book, COVID was in full flood, but the AI platforms that we're now wrestling with hadn't really been launched. But now that they have, I thought, well, if I was writing it with the benefit of AI, what would I learn from that? And so I started with DALL-E. DALL-E, I mean, this is kind of their joke. I don't know if you've tried it, but that's their image creating AI engine. And so I plugged into it history of British identity, and the result came back in about 5 seconds. Okay, it is slightly surrealist, so it lives up to the name. Union flag, bit simplistic, bit UK-centric. Big Med in Westminster, some judges, I think, but actually not much really that makes any sense at all. And I thought at least AI could get the Union flag the right way up. So next I tried Anatomy of Britain. Definitely biological, but pleasingly archaeological, some random gizzards, but it's still not really telling a very coherent story. So that really cheered me up a lot. And so feeling confident, I went for the big one. I went for the mothership. I asked ChatGPT to write me 50 words on a history of British identity. British identity, formed from the melding of indigenous Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking and Norman influences, expanded during the British Empire, absorbing global cultural aspects. The 20th and 21st centuries saw further evolution with increased immigration, EU membership, Brexit and devolution, making it an increasingly complex and diverse construct. Wow. It took me several years and 250,000 words to do what the publisher asked, while the bot nailed it with pleasing concision in 1.5 seconds. So, frantic to find fault with it, I looked again. And actually, one of the glaring problems is that it assumes that there is a British identity, whereas we all know that there are actually plurality. And we've spent history vying with each other like cats in a sack. So one uniform identity is wishful thinking. But also, I was absolutely delighted to see that it only gave me 48 words. And publishers hate that kind of thing. I mean, you have to deliver what you're asked. So tentatively, I conclude that as a historian, my job is safe for now. But that said, if I was a history teacher, I probably would be considering my options at reading the next 20 years' worth of essays written by ChatGPT. So I decided to do a history of British identity in 50 documents. And in one sense, it's a quite naked vehicle for just telling the history of Britain again, but to give it a theme. But documents fascinate me particularly because I wanted to go back and listen to the voices of people. What is it that people were saying about their worlds and their lives and their identities? And really, documents is the best way to do that. And I wanted to get away from the large charters, the big legal documents, the Acts of Parliament, and the things that we all know as sort of official history. And I wanted to go more back to some of the documents that we don't see so often in the history books, but that tell something just a little bit more vivid. And in doing that, it does raise the question of, well, is there anything we can think of that links Carlisle, Cork, Cardiff, Canterbury, and the rest of these islands? And sometimes it feels that the answer is yes, rivalry. And that's not actually a new phenomenon. The Anglo-Saxons gave Wales its name, Wiales, it means slaves in Old Welsh. And a 10th century Welsh poet didn't take it lying down and replied to the compliment by calling them the shitheads of Thanet. Sometimes not a lot's changed. Well, I'm not an ethnologist, and this book is not a study of the island's different tribes. But what I've tried to do is look at the different parts and some of the important documents from the people. Occasionally, I've had to go with the big ones. So the Bayeux Tapestry is there, yes, needs to be, or it would never get sold in America. But obvious things are not there, like Shakespeare, for example, because there are a million books on Shakespeare and nobody really needs to read another one. So what have I taken as my definition of document? Well, I went back to the dictionary and I took away something written, inscribed, etc., which furnishes evidence or information upon any subject as a manuscript, title deed, tombstone, coin, picture, etc. So we've got quite a lot of leeway. There are pictures, there is music. It's not just the straightforward written word. So our first document comes from long before there's any writing, which by definition is when history begins. History begins when writing begins. So anything pre-writing is prehistoric. And it's the carvings on Stonehenge. And as we've got no writing from the period to contextualize them, we actually have no clue what they mean. They are 115 axe heads and 3 daggers. Archaeologists are really very good, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult any archaeologists in the room for whom I have huge respect, but they're very good when they don't know, of saying, well, it probably has religious significance or ceremonial significance. So that's the explanation we're given for the daggers and axe heads. But what I can't really get away from, and it is one of the themes that comes up in this book and also in the rest of what we're hearing about today, is that actually all parts of this nation have been incredibly combative and warlike for a very, very long time. So I feel that in that first document, we are getting something show grounding for us, that the history of these islands is going to be one that does involve a huge amount of conflict and a large degree of people saying, this is my turf, not yours. So when did humans first appear in Britain? Late in the human story, interestingly, around the first, about 1 million BC. Humans had first appeared in the world about 2.8 million BC. So it took them a while to get this far north. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered footprints in the sand at a place called Haysborough in Norfolk. And it was a group of 5 adults and some children, and it was on a beach, and they were scampering towards what is now Great Yarmouth. And these turned out to be not only the oldest footprints in Britain, dating to about 900 BC, so almost 1 million BC, but also the oldest footprints in the world outside Africa. And not connected to my previous remarks about archaeologists, but within 2 weeks, they got washed away from the beach because they weren't properly protected, so they're not there anymore. But casts of them were taken and can still be seen. Those humans weren't yet Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens didn't evolve for quite a while after that. So the first hominids coming onto the British Isles were effectively big game hunters coming from the continent onto what was the British Peninsula, which was still then attached. So they were coming, they were going, they were dodging the weather, also dodging ice ages, of course, many ice ages. At the moment, we're in the Holocene ice age. interglacial, sorry, the Flandrian, and all human existence has taken place in that one interglacial. The Divensian, which ended before it, ended around 10,000 BC, and that's when we get the first permanent settlers onto the British Peninsula. There are people called Maglemosians, and they very definitely were Homo sapiens. And fascinatingly, they didn't last fully, because around the time of Stonehenge, there were two almost complete replacements of the DNA on the British Peninsula. First, around 4000 BC, with the farming revolution, probably one of the most important moments in the history of humankind, because it stopped everybody being hunters and gatherers and settled them down and allowed them to sit, farm, cultivate livestock, crops, and therefore give rise to civilization and more sedentary culture. And then secondly, around 2500 BC, when the Bell Beaker people came over, and from DNA, it's possible to know that within about 1,000 years, they'd replaced 95% of DNA in the country. Shortly after that, we can add our first real identity, and that identity is Celtic. But it's important to retain that when people use that term in this context, they don't mean anything political or anything even genetic. It's a cultural term for some shared cultural practices, burial practices, and also some shared languages. Back to the first settlers, the Maglemosians. You may remember a while ago in 2018, the National History Museum produced this and managed to cause a certain amount of chattering in Britain at understanding that the first permanent settlers in Britain had dark skin. And that's one of the lovely things about history, is that there are always fun surprises. Our archipelago, the British Peninsula now is an archipelago of about 5,000 islands, of which about 200 are inhabited, is all about the geography. And the first time we know anything about its geography is in about the 6th century BC, when there was a Greek sailor who rounded the crest of Brittany, and he saw ahead of him two islands, which he reported as being Albion, that's Britain, and the Sacred Isle, which is Ireland. So that's the first written record. That's their first appearance of us in history. At the time that we were first looking at, not the time of this Greek sailor, this is a little bit beforehand, when we're talking about the Maglemosians and Cresswellians and other settlers, the geography of Britain looked very different. And the geography has determined so much of the history and the rivalry, formed by the Ice Ages. And as you can see, what happened was that in around 6,200 BC, the last ice was melting and sea levels rose by about 120 meters, which puts it in quite some context when we think about our concerns today. The world does warm often a lot, but just on a much bigger timescale. In those periods of warmth, Britain has been desert, has had lions and hyenas and tigers and elephants. At other times has been under ice 3 miles thick. The problem at the moment is things are warming too quickly through artificial means. But around 6,200 BC, something in the region of 730 cubic miles of continental shelf snapped off Norway. And this caused a tidal wave about 15 meters high to push its way all the way west. It filled in this area which is called Doggerland, where the Thames and the Rhine met. It also created the English Channel, and very shortly afterwards it separated Ireland from Britain. I will talk about the British Isles in a geographical sense, including Ireland, throughout this talk. Now, there are quite a few statues in this book, because the time I was writing it, Statue Gate was just erupting. And I do ask for one statue to be removed, but we'll get to that at the end. But the first statue we come to is Boudicca. And this is Thomas Thornycroft's one, Boadicea and his daughters, who are thundering dramatically past London's Parliament in their chariot, which is all pimped out Hollywood style with blades on the wheels. And Boudicca, as we know, her name probably comes from Brythonic, from the Old Welsh bud, meaning victory. So she is actually Victoria. She, as we know, was a Celtic chieftain's wife under Roman-occupied Britain. And when the Romans flogged her and raped her daughters, she rose in rebellion, descended on Roman Colchester, London and St Albans, burning and crucifying. Eventually the Romans found her. They met her in open battle with 2 legions. She didn't make it. Nobody quite knows what happened to her. She did make it off the battlefield, but whether she committed suicide or died through poison is not clear. Rumour says that she was buried between platforms 9 and 10 under King's Cross Station. It's a Victorian myth, but it does long predate Harry Potter and Platform 9 3/4. We know quite a lot about British chariot warfare from the period because Julius Caesar visited in 55 and 54 BC, and he wrote about his observations on chariot warfare in the Gallic War. And the Gallic War is one of the earliest actual written documents in the book. And it's a visiting Roman's view of Britain and the Celtic tribes and what he saw there. We can't, of course, discount the fact that a lot of it may well be propaganda, because part of writing the Gallic War was for him to tell everybody in Rome what a hero he was. They needed to give him more money, more political power. And the way he did that was by writing a best-selling biography of his incredible military deeds. So the more he can make out that the people he was coming across, dealing with, being brave in front of, made him look like more of a hero. So anyone who's ever sat through Latin lessons at school will recognise the opening words. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Also, if you read Asterix too. So Caesar delves into everything: ethnicity, food, economy, families, noting that everybody lives in large, multi-generational units. It's all very polygamous between the generations. But as a military man, he's particularly excited by the chariot warfare. And he says, by daily practice and exercise, they become so skilled that they can gallop their horses at full tilt down the steepest slopes without losing control, and check and turn them instantly, and run along the pole, and stand on the yoke, and then in the blink of an eye, dart back into the chariot. These British charioteers terrified Caesar's commanders so much, and they told him that they'd never seen anything remotely like it, and they were not really very happy to engage with it. And the following century, the great Roman historian Tacitus, who was married to the Roman governor of Britain's daughter, so did have some idea of what was going on here, found the Britons noticeably fierce among all of the Celts, and noted particularly that the French Celts did once have it, but had now absolutely lost it. He did note, though, that back in their glory days, one Gallic tribe had quite fancied themselves, and at the Battle of Telamon in 225 BC, they stripped off all of their clothes, quote, owing to their proud confidence in themselves. And then they took the Romans on naked. Sadly, that day, their moxie did not carry it for them. Chariot burials are quite rare in Europe. They're known from China, Cyprus, India, Russia, Germany, France, and East Yorkshire. And in 2001, archaeologists at Wetwang, which is about 20 miles east of York, unearthed the skeleton and a chariot buried along with lavish grave goods. And it was a spectacular find because they assumed it was a Celtic ruler, probably a king. But when they examined the skeleton, they found out it was actually a woman. And there have been many similar recent discoveries with burials from the Iron Age and also in the Anglo-Saxon and Viking Age, where lots of people who were assumed to be men, including Viking warriors, have turned out to be women. And so it's a salutary lesson for all historians to check and double check, particularly work that was done over a century ago. Now, there's no written records of the deeds of people like the Wetwang chariot woman. And history books aren't really known for their massive collection of female characters. But this book does have many, because they are actually there. And they're often there in the documents too. So we'll meet some of those. The first woman in Britain, of course, that everybody really knows about is Britannia. And the Romans named Britain after a warrior goddess, Britannia, equipped her with her trident, shield, and triton. But she left, really, when the Romans left in 410 AD, and only came back with Charles II on the Restoration, since when there's usually been a Britannia on some piece of British coinage in circulation. Now, history, we said, starts with writing. So the first indigenous writing from these islands is what is known as the Bloomberg tablets. They're from about 100 AD, and they are wax on wood, and so inscribed into the wax. And this is one of my favorites because it's an admonition to somebody who is not identified to tell them that if they want to be taken more seriously in the forum, in business, they should really stop looking so scruffy and dress more smartly. One of my favourite documents from Roman Britain comes from AD 100. So that's about 40 years after Boudicca's defeat. Is it on? Good. So the Roman fort of Vindolanda, which many of you may have visited in Northumberland, is about 30 miles west of Newcastle. And in the 1970s, archaeologists began digging up these little slivers of wood on which there is writing with ink, not with wax, but with ink. They're still digging them up. They've dug up over 1,000 of them. And this one is from a Roman army wife, probably in her late teens or early 20s, because she talks about her very young son. Her name was Claudia Severa, and she lived somewhere near Vindolanda. So she was writing to her friend who was at Vindolanda and asking her friend to come to her birthday. Her friend is Sulpicia Lepidina, and her husband was the commander of the 9th cohort of Batavians at Vindolanda, which was a Dutch formation. So the invitation looks pretty ghastly at first, but let's unscramble it. So that this evening, after whatever else you've done today, you can say that you have read some ancient Roman partyware. So if you look closely, there are two different handwritings on this. One covers most of the tablet, the other covers just the bottom right-hand corner, which I've edged in red. So let's look at the first one. The opening in the blue box, the first two letters are actually quite clear, C and L. So that's short for Claudia, that's her name. And then the next word is her surname, Severa. The S is a bit unfamiliar. The E is quite make-outable, long and large. The V, well, it's a U, is small and clear. The R has a long ascender. The A is quite heavily tilted to the left, and so that's her name. That you've just read Claudia Severa. And now you've got your eye in, you can pick out her friend's name more easily. We've seen we're still on this one, the L and the E before. Then you can see the small P-I-D-N, and it ends with the same A-E, Lepidinae, dative case because it is to Lepidina. Now, the next box stirs the historian's blood and is even more exciting than that, I can promise you, because this is written in Claudia's own handwriting. And not only is this the first woman's writing from Britain, but this is the first woman's writing from anywhere in the entire Roman world. And that's quite amazing when you think that Britain was just a barbarous little nodule on the sort of northwestern tip of the Roman Empire. These islands were not known for their literacy. Cicero, writing at the time of Julius Caesar's expedition to Britain, said, "I do hope he brings some slaves back, but I don't have any high hopes that they'll have any literary or musical talent." Her writing is a little trickier, but you can make out the vale, farewell, and anima, soul. Right, writing really gets going after the Romans leave, when the Celts start writing lots, particularly poetry, and the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. So as we know, the Anglo-Saxons came from today's Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, and they succeeded in settling the indigenous Celtic lands of England, into which the Celts either assimilated or were pushed largely into Wales. So this is the sub-Roman period, the age of Arthur, and it's very fashionable to say that Arthur didn't exist. I think he did. Clearly, there's a vast array of medieval Arthurian documentation. The Matter of Britain, as it's known. The Matter of France is all the legends on Charlemagne. The Matter of Rome is classical Roman mythology that was recycled in the medieval period. So we have the Matter of Britain. But there is historical record of Arthur underneath all of that. The earliest is actually from 575 to 600, and it's a Welsh poem called the Gododdin. And it tells the story of a mighty warrior called Gwawaddur, who was fighting incredibly bravely on the battlefield and held off the blood-red swords of the Anglo-Saxons, pretty much carried the day himself. But the last line of the poem says, "But he was no Arthur." So even in that period, we know that Arthur was somebody who needed no introduction, who already had a reputation as a very real warrior. So the Anglo-Saxons made laws, wrote about science, theology, philosophy, but the thing that they really loved most was poetry, writing it and listening to it sung. And one of the beauties of Anglo-Saxon, if you've ever had any chance to read any, we have to call it Old English now, it was renamed around the time of the First World War, to stop it sounding so German, is its kennings. Those word pictures were symbolism used instead of a word. So whale bath, seal road for sea, or heaven candle for sun, or bone house for body. Their poetry is absolutely full of these. And it's incredibly vivid and atmospheric. The most famous, of course, is Beowulf, which Seamus Heaney naturally brought to another generation, another audience, largely, I think, because it is one of the most spectacular pieces of writing ever to have come out of these islands. The initial challenge with it is that it does have unfamiliar letters, and also, of course, it has very unfamiliar vocabulary. I mean, some of the letters which you actually lasted quite late into printing, quite a few of them, used for other things. The AE, the ash, which is just an A, the thorn, the win, the eth. The thorn, of course, survived very, very late into printing. If you look at original printings of Shakespeare or the King James Bible, you see the thorn used actually because it's a printer's convention. It was actually short for the. But people then misread it and wrote it as a Y, so you get YE, so you always get ye olde bun shop or something, which is nonsense. It's a thorn. So yes, if you take less into account, the thundering beginning of Beowulf is what, which means what, but in this context means listen or listen up, which is a reminder of the fact this poetry was designed to be recited and sung. Another challenge of Anglo-Saxon is that it's inflected. In other words, like Latin, Greek, Russian, German, many other languages, it has endings on the nouns, so you have to learn a whole load of endings. But if you play around with the words and say them out loud, they're not too difficult to understand, really. Beowulf is min nama is not a million miles away from Beowulf is my name. Fjord in Hella is quite recognisably Fiend in Hell. Beowulf is something that people shouldn't be scared of reading. It is a very, very fun book. You'll love this because there are plenty of Vikings in Ireland, and particularly here in Cork. This is the Vikings' answer to Beowulf. This is some Viking poetry. This is the sayings of the High One. It was composed around 900 AD, probably in Norway, and it's wisdom sayings from Odin to probably anyone who'll listen. So I'll read you a couple of them, and you'll gather from the tone of it. It does say something about why, particularly in Britain, parts of the country where Vikings were left more strongly in places like Yorkshire, people have a reputation for great stoicism. So, he is a foolish man who lies awake all night and broods over everything. When morning breaks, he is weary, and all his trouble is the same as it was. A man should not stint himself in the use of money he has made. Many a time what is meant for friends is being saved up for foes. Things often turn out worse than we anticipate. Praise no day until evening, no wife until she is burnt, no sword until tested, no maid until given in marriage, no ice until crossed, no ale until it has been drunk. Vikings, of course, had a religion that didn't believe in an afterlife, so much of Viking society was about being appreciated and respected by your peers while you were alive. For them, there was no judgment, there was nothing to look forward to, there was simply the final conflagration at Ragnarok. So I mentioned music, the first piece of music, Summer Is A-Comin' In, which you still hear performed as a jolly spring song, with the melody unchanged from its medieval original. And the notation is really very, very readable if you've had any exposure to the medieval neume system, which you often still see, obviously, in plain chant and books that go along with liturgy. So not only is this the earliest non-Latin folk song in Europe, it's also the oldest six-part harmony known, the oldest canon known, and the oldest song to have an ostinato. And if you don't know it, it really is well worth dialing up on YouTube to listen to the sound of springtime Britain in the 1200s. Right, Simon mentioned there was some Ireland, and there is. Ireland is mentioned throughout the book in lots of different ways, but there are two chapters specifically on Ireland. One is from the beginning of time up till 1949 in the renunciation of Dominion status, and the other takes us from August 69 in Derry to the Belfast Agreement in 98 and deals with the Troubles. But there are plenty of other mentions of Ireland, and this is one of them, the Kildare poems. So we're still in medieval times. This is from the land of Cockaigne, and it's one of the 16 Kildare poems, which are from around 1330. And this story is a tale of a community of dissipated monks, probably the Cistercians from Clonmel, and their frolics of nude swimming and physical antics with local nuns. In terms of identity, what's really interesting about it is that it is written in a dialect of Middle English, but with very heavy Irish influences. Its origin in Kildare is tentative. A brother Michael of Kildare identifies himself as one of the authors. There's also a link with the peers of Birmingham, who is known to have been in Kildare, but there's also a Waterford connection too. So it may well be that it's one of those pieces of writing that accumulated from a number of different places. In any event, what it tells us is that within 160 years of Henry II and Strongbow coming to these islands, French-speaking Normans had given way or allowed space for Middle English-speaking people with strong Irish influences. As we know, plague ripped through the British Isles in 1348-49, and of course it did get to Ireland. One of the most famous accounts comes from a Franciscan, John Klyn of Kilkenny. And seeing the plague approaching, he wrote in his chronicle, "I leave parchment for the continuation of this work, in case anyone might still be alive in the future and any son of Adam escapes this pestilence and can continue the work." No one did, and the manuscript which survives is thereafter blank. This is from St Mary's in Ashwell, which is not far from Cambridge, and it's quite melancholic graffiti. I've traced over it with pen, which is why it looks a bit weird, but so you can read it a bit more clearly. And the author is very unhappy about who survives. Pestilentia, plague, 1350. Pitiable, savage, violent, the dregs of the people, pessimar plebs, survive to witness. There's also another line, which is the very first plague, which says the first plague came in 1349. And it's quite interesting for people who are a bit geeky about numbers, how the author wrote the year. He's got M for 1,000, ter CCC for 300, then L minus uno for 50 minus 1. I mean, it couldn't be more complicated if you tried, really, could it? The original 1349 plague killed probably about half of Britain. The return in 1361 killed about 20%, but mainly of the young people. So it was doubly catastrophic because it took out the survivors. It kept returning for about 300 years regularly, often taking out about 20% of the people until 1655, when it was finally, that was the last one before the Great Fire. Now, moving to the Reformation, one of the enduring legacies, from a documentary perspective, is, of course, the King James Bible. There had been many translations of the Bible in vernacular times. It's an utter myth that the Reformation brought translations of the Bible. There are hundreds of Anglo-Saxon Bibles, medieval French Bibles, medieval German Bibles, Old English Bibles. I don't know how the myth is stuck, but Bible translating was a very common thing. What was not common was unpermitted Bible translating, and that's what most of the Reformation scholars got in trouble for doing it off their own bats. But the actual act of translating is very old. So the work for the King James Version was done by 6 companies of scholars, 2 at each of Oxford, Cambridge and Westminster. And among them were the country's most accomplished linguists and theologians, and some of them were incredibly colourful characters. So my favourite is a guy who was called Richard Dutch Thompson, who was a gifted philologist, and he was described by one contemporary Puritan as, and I quote, a dissolute, ebrious, profane, luxurious, deboiced, drunken English Dutchman, who seldom went one night to bed sober. And it turns out that at the same time as doing his translation work on the King James Bible, he was translating the unbelievably filthy epigrams of the Roman poet Martial. And so it's always struck me, what would have happened if he'd gone to the King James meeting with the wrong sheaf of papers? There is a short story in there for someone if they want to write it. Another document I'm very fond of is this by Isaac Newton. And in the same way that identity often seems to defy classification, so does Newton. I could have chosen his great work of physics, the De Principia, but instead I went for this, which is his translation of a work called the Emerald Tablet, which is a key document in the history of alchemy, Hermeticism, the Western mystery tradition, because today we think of Newton as a key pioneer in the developmental of experimental science, one of the founders of the Enlightenment, father of physics. All is true. But he was also a liminal figure in that he was, and as John Maynard Keynes, his great biographer, said, he was the last of the magicians. He had something of the Magi of ancient Mesopotamia. He spent so much of his time dealing with mysterious things, alchemy. He had his own still and laboratory at King's. He was fascinated, equally as fascinated by the numerology of King Solomon's Temple as he was by physics or optics or light. For him, all of these were ways to prove that God was the creator, and they were all equally valid. And actually, he gave up doing his physics and his maths quite young in his life and spent the remainder of his time really working on the esoteric side. He thought he was a prophet inspired by God, that the Bible was speaking to him personally, that he was one of the last in the great line of prophets. So to Newton, this was a very important part of his work. And Britain can be such an enigma that we've forgotten about that aspect of him. In the same way, we've forgotten a lot about the identities of the different parts of the British Isles as well. So I just thought he was a nice example of the ways in which we all continue to see through a glass darkly about very many of these topics. Right, I especially love this stuff on Karl Marx. So this is the report of a police officer, I'm going to show you in a minute, looking into Karl Marx's application for citizenship. So he had been living in London for years. He came over after the revolutions on the continent, and he suffered chronically from a weak heart, respiratory problems, neuralgia, liver and gallbladder complaints, rheumatism, headaches, inflamed eyes, and most unpleasantly for him, what he described as furuncles and carbuncles under the place Goethe mentions. He therefore took lots of spa breaks. And so in this one, he wanted to go spa break in Germany. And he thought, well, the best way to make sure that he wasn't arrested when he got there would be to have a British passport. So he applied for one. Sadly, Sergeant W. Reiners of the Metropolitan Police had other ideas. And this is his report. And he says, he is the notorious German agitator, the head of the International Society and an advocate of communistic principles. This man has not been loyal to his own king and country. And that final sentence was enough to make sure that Marx's application was terminal and never granted. However, the discovery I liked about him the most was that he rarely finished anything. He sat in the British Museum day in, day out, wading through oceans of books. He set himself to Das Kapital and gleefully wrote about it to Engels, whom he wrote to about everything, including his carbuncles and furuncles. And he said that he would be finished, quote, with this economic crap. And I've given you the German there if you don't believe me. In 5 weeks, which was a little optimistic because he published Das Kapital 16 years later and it sank without trace. But another piece of music is Vaughan Williams' score for The Lark Ascending. And this piece makes it into the book because it has a double poignancy. Vaughan Williams first scored it for piano in 2014. And then when he returned from the trenches in 1920, he scored it for orchestra. Now that paradigm of doing it first for piano and then for orchestra was quite common because people would take the piano part, play it at home. It was a nice, cheap way of getting music out there. If it's successful, then you might orchestrate it for much more expensive production. But the bookending of 1914 and 1920 really works in this instance when one thinks about the horrors of the First World War. Because the sort of sense of serenity that he's evoking, one feels very much as a response to his experiences in the trenches. And also the second poignancy is that now when one looks around so much of the countryside in the British Isles, it has been completely devastated and destroyed from what it was that Vaughan Williams would have seen. Pesticides have taken out an unfeasible number of the variety of birds, butterflies, flowers, you name it, even including the skylark. So it's a musical memorial, really, to the countryside as was before the very heavy use of pesticides in the second half of the 20th century. Right, this one is for Churchill or De Valera fans, because I think you probably can't be both. I'm not sure. I did ask my taxi driver from Kinsale what people thought of De Valera around here, and he said, "Who?" So, but I know he was joking. So this is from the 7th of December 1941. The Japanese Navy Air Squadron had just bombed the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. Churchill received news of this in Chequers, and he was so overjoyed because he knew that the USA would now have to enter the war and that the defeat of Nazism was more imminent. So he decided it was another opportunity to ask De Valera for access to some of the deep water ports in Ireland that Churchill had reserved to the British in the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, but Chamberlain had given back in 1928. So Churchill fired this telegram off to De Valera at 12:20 in the morning. And it says, most immediate, now is your chance, now or never, a nation once again, and very ready to meet you at any time. So the meaning is 100% clear and somewhat surprising that Churchill knew the song. But as we know, De Valera did not take him up on the offer. And many reasons are often cited, including De Valera being informed that Churchill had been drunk when he wrote the telegram. But the reality is almost certainly that the price was simply too high. De Valera had been holding steadfastly to the policy of neutrality, even though, of course, he had been very friendly in returning down pilots and sending fire engines to the north. But this telegram is opportunistic, it's Churchillian, but it does remain the most famous offer ever by Westminster to talk to Ireland's leaders about reunification. So I said I'd come back to statues and which statue I think could usefully be removed. There are several questions around why Richard the Lionheart rides a prancing horse outside London's Parliament. In the famous words of William Stubbs, the Victorian historian and antiquarian, a bad son, a bad husband, a selfish ruler, and a vicious man, and this states it, he was no Englishman. For example, on Crusade, while he was in negotiations with Saladin over returning about 3,000 captured Muslim prisoners in return for the True Cross, which Saladin had decamped with after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin broke off negotiations, which is a standard tactic in any negotiations, and Richard the Lionheart promptly had the 3,000 people, including women and children, marched to a hillside where Saladin and his men could see them, had them disemboweled and beheaded. So even for the 12th century, Richard was not a pleasant person and showed extraordinarily chilling levels of brutality. And I always wonder why Britain venerates Richard the Lionheart, particularly because he hated Britain. He only visited twice, and he's on record as saying, if I could have sold London, I would, but I couldn't find a buyer. He sold everything that wasn't nailed down to fund his crusades. So why he's the schoolchildren's favourite is just a mystery to me. And this will come as no surprise to anybody. Many of you will know this quotation well, but I put it in the book because there are lots of people in England particularly who don't. And this is Cromwell, of course, on landing in Ireland. You are all part of Antichrist, whose kingdom the scriptures so expressly speaks should be laid in blood, yea, in the blood of the saints. You have shed great store of that already, and ere it is long, you must all of you have blood to drink, even the dregs of the cup of the fury and the wrath of God, which will be poured out unto you. We all know what the result was, and his statement afterwards, that it was a righteous judgment of God. And when you read this, and you read his general correspondence, it's quite plain that he's not mentally well. But World War I killed 2% of the British population. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which were his wars, killed 3% of England, 6% of Scotland, and 15 to 20% of Ireland. And I don't think when you listen to his words and you read his thoughts, and if you look at his letters, that you can see anything other than a really, really furious religious extremist. And those days are gone, or they should be. And one of the reasons why he shouldn't particularly be there is that, of course, he's venerated by many people as a Democrat, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Because albeit that he got rid of monarchy, that's not the definition of democracy. And he promptly closed down Parliament and ruled with a military junta and was a military dictator. So, I mean, there's no planet on which he's a Democrat. So if we remove any statue, I would ask that he gets taken to an unexceptional museum and left in rather a dark corner somewhere. And what comes out clearly of the 50 documents is that down the centuries, Britain has been home to numerous invaders and settlers from all over Europe and the world. In the 1800s, the Times proudly proclaimed, every civilized people on the face of the earth must be fully aware that this country is the asylum of nations, and that it would defend the asylum to the last ounce of its treasures and the last drop of its blood. There is no point whatever on which we are prouder and more resolute. And a few years later, it returned to the theme, it is part of our identity to be the refuge of nations, from our ancient fusion of many races and hospitality to many refugees. We derive both the precedent and the capacity for sympathizing with all the tribes of humanity. So this was the late 1800s when waves of migrants arrived, including Marx's family. Later in World War II, of course, Poles, Czechs, Australians, New Zealanders, Rhodesians, South Africans, and many others came to Britain to take part in World War II. Lots of them fought, including in the long hot summer of the Battle of Britain, and Britain never was in any sense alone. And there was also, of course, after that, very intense post-World War II immigration. And what does that all mean for Britain's identity? Well, at the end of World War II, the UK was largely a country of white people, with English as the only language that was really spoken at home. But the 14 years from 48 to 62 saw liberal immigration from those living in the British Empire and Commonwealth, particularly Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Hong Kong. And many people from those countries, of course, had fought in the wars. India alone sent 3.9 million volunteers to both world wars. So in 1954, Henry Hopkinson, who was Conservative Minister for Colonial Affairs under Churchill, stood up in Parliament and set out the vision. Said any British subject from the colonies is free to enter this country at any time, as long as he can produce satisfactory evidence of his British status. This is not something we want to tamper with lightly. In a world in which restrictions on personal movement and immigration have increased, we still take pride in the fact a man can say civis Britannicus sum, whatever his colour may be, and we can take pride in the fact that he wants and can come to his mother country. It was a classical imperial model, just as Rome had extended citizenship to all the provinces, including Britannia, with the Edict of Caracalla in 212. In Britain, this 40s and 50s immigration policy was followed after the 1992 Maastricht Treaty with the framework for freedom of movement of persons within the EU, opening up the right for British nationals to settle anywhere in the EU and for nationals to settle in Britain. So in 2016, year of the Brexit referendum, official figures show there were 3.5 million EU migrants in Britain, alongside 5.6 million non-EU migrants, largely from the Commonwealth, together equaling 13.9% of the British population of 65 million. So this all has an effect on the mix of heritages in Britain. In the census of 2011, 19.5% of people in England and Wales identified as something other than white British, the most mixed city, of course, being London. One inescapable conclusion of all these invasions and migrations is that from the prehistoric times to the 21st century, Britain has been a country with a great variety, which a great variety of people have called home. So let's bring some of all of this together. The Ships is the last document in the book. It sums up so much of the history in the names, and it's just peregrination around the British Isles in its broader sense. There's Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, French, Spanish. It's a meditation around the coastline and the richness of our innumerable pasts. Down the centuries, there have been so many identities, often simultaneously, and that really is what the book explores, right from the start. There are some themes, though. Stonehenge's axe heads and daggers show a competitive and tribal and warlike group of people, and I really don't think that that's ever changed. Another theme is accidental genius. So many leading lights of our four nations have done amazing, world-changing things on the side. We seem to be a group of exceptional hobbyists. Chaucer was a public official and diplomat. Caxton was a merchant. Baskerville was a Japaner. Sloane, his collection found at the British Museum, was a physician. Ada Byron, the first ever computer programmer, was a socialite. Berners-Lee was designing a phone directory when he created the World Wide Web. The list is endless. Also, I think humour, anarchic humour, is a standout feature of these islands. Shortly before the Brexit referendum, the German newspaper Die Welt ran a final issue of Britain's World War I's bitingly humorous trench newspaper, the Wipers Times. There's actually a lovely new edition available, which is not expensive, and pleaded with us not to deprive Europe of Britain's unique and scurrilous humour. Quote, "Life without British humour, it lamented, is possible, but meaningless." The original Wipers Times is absolutely hilarious. It's Spike Milligan-esque, it's zany, it's proto-Python, also amateurs. I mean, they were all soldiers. And I love this subaltern. Am I as offensive as I might be? It's full of madcap sketches and poems, like this one. Merry little whiz-bang, jolly little crump, makes our trench a picture, wiggle-woggle-wump. I think today we're somewhat lost. All the nations of the British Isles are in a very different place than 100 to 150 years ago, which we're hearing so much about here. There are complex questions of post-colonial transition and identity, particularly behind something like Brexit. Multiculturalism and demographic changes have happened relatively quickly, and many major cities are unrecognisable from a century ago. My sense is that we're working towards a new identity and new identities that in some way look all the way back to the distant past and understand our complexities and this very rich range of heritages, and also recognise that we are a European construct. Like our neighbours, we are a product of Romanitas, of that shared medieval world. We're all witnesses to the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, to empire and to post-empire, and now to the challenges of liberal democracy in the information age. The richness of our past is encouraging and inspiring, and indicates that our identities in the 21st century will not be elusive, but are there for the grasping. We have work to do, and so my last task was to go back to DALL-E, the AI engine, and I asked it to give us a picture of England, a picture of Ireland, a picture of Scotland, and a picture of Wales. The first challenge was that I had to ask it to redo England 4 times because it kept sticking a flag of St George on it for no particular reason. I'll leave you to guess which is which, but the results, disappointingly, look largely identical, which confirms that we still do need historians to celebrate the differences and details and to weave them together into the story of our archipelago. Thank you very much for listening.
Having started a bit late, nonetheless, we have time. So
Brilliant.
questions for Dominic. I told you he should be impossible to like, but somehow.
Wait till you hear the questions.
Any Manx or Cornish references in your 50 items?
Yes.
In terms of they being entities or nations of the...
Yes. Manx, no. Mentioned in passing, but not documents. Cornish documents, yes. I've got miracle plays, medieval miracle plays, written in Cornish. Because one of the, again, going back to Bible translations and so on, a lot of liturgy and church life happened in vernacular languages. And at the time when English language was imposed across the liturgy of the new Church of England, there was a rebellion in the West Country. And one of the things that they were rebelling about is they didn't want English, they didn't understand it. They wanted to be able to have their mass and their sacred books and their mystery plays in Cornish. So I've got Cornish mystery plays.
In your picture of the Tudor trumpeter, I don't think you actually mentioned him out loud. Do we know anything about him?
John Blank. Yeah, John Blank. Mm-hmm. So he served at Henry's court and at Edward VI's court. Blank is probably a joke. It's probably blanc. It's probably white. It's probably a black and white joke. But he's known. He's in the records. He's paid as a trumpeter. That's a picture of him in the Westminster Tournament Roll, which is in the College of Arms. There are quite a lot of examples of non-white people in medieval documentation and pictures, so that's one of them. In Salisbury Cathedral, there is a row of stonemasons who built the original cathedral in the 13th century, early 13th century, and one of them is quite manifestly an African head. Yeah.
What's your observation of the fact that the GPT version of our identity is identical to the landscape you're sitting in right now, standing in right now?
I'm amazed at that it has picked up on the sort of rural, bucolic, idyllic, I would say Irish and Scottish, effectively, landscapes. In the English one, it's just stuck a slightly sort of less interesting house on it. But yes, maybe it's no accident that these come from America.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. A follow-up to the question we just had about the landscapes and Vaughan Williams's Lark Ascending. And I wonder how much you think that the landscape and the environment is a unifying force for all the different types of people in the Isles. whether it's just, you know, perhaps people in this room who feel very strongly attached to it.
I think pre-industrial revolution, it was something that everybody shared. You know, in your home before the industrial revolution, you would have had artifacts and objects either made by you or people in your village or very close by. Within, you know, 30, 40 years of the industrial revolution, your home is filled with cookware, earthenware, metal, cutlery. It's come from hundreds of miles away. We're shipping things all around the world. So that sense of sort of country neighbourhoodness, which I think was very shared, different but shared, was similar, was really rather exploded. And if you go to London now, of course, there's very little sense of any of that. But in the countryside, yes, I think it is very similar. We all put up with a fairly similar climate. We have pretty similar interests in similar animals, cheeses, interest in ales, stouts, you know, whatever it might be. There is a lot in the countryside, I do think, that does bring us together. And that is distinct from if you go to Italy or Spain or France. It is British. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, I was going to say, there's two statues, the Richard, the Lionheart, and Cromwell. Who commissioned them? Were they public subscriptions, or were
Public
they
subscriptions.
government? So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
were an identity in the mid and late 19th century.
Which is a fascinating point. That actually the public mood then was the public wanted to put these up. Yeah. Mm. Couldn't be more different now.
To be fair, if you pointed your camera over to the left and looked at the statues in the square next to Parliament, it paints a different story.
True. It's an evolving story, isn't it? It's an evolving tapestry. But they're still there. They do baffle me. But yes, you're right. There are much more modern ones too.
The statues must have had a much more important part. It's a trivial point. It used to be under the direct control of the cabinet and secretary of state. Local people, Londoners, weren't allowed to erect statues. They had to be seen to be part of some corporate united view of what it is that we're portraying, I think.
I think that's very valid, and they're very didactic, aren't they? They often have panels which tell you the official version of what it is that they did. Yeah.
They usually may.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions for Dominic? If not, the book is available, courtesy of Carl O'Donovan in the Octagon. And it may well be that Paul Lay, who is with us and is an expert on Cromwell, has things to say about
Oh, super.
the man behind the statue a little bit later on. Was there another last question? No. Oh, well, with that, thank you, Dominic, for a fascinating.
Thank you very much.